As Matt pointed out, I'm Kirk. The last name's pronounced Knestis. Don't let you get thrown by the silent K. You see it in print, but we don't get to talk often enough anymore. So clarify that for you. I run a firm called Evaluand LLC, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means here in a couple of seconds. But we are going to talk about money matters. And this was a bit of a play on words because we think money matters, but this is about matters pertaining to money. And as Matt might have mentioned, my history is such that I got here from kind of a weird place. I had lots of opportunities to screw up business decisions that related to money, going all the way back to 1984, when I started my first company before I finished my bachelor's degree out in Washington State. So I've always been inclined to do this sort of thing. I'm a career changer. I became an evaluator after stints in the private sector and K-12 education and higher ed. I have been doing evaluation work for about 20 years now, and I've worked for a couple of different large nonprofits, regional education labs and an independent nonprofit that actually went bankrupt, and was a super interesting learning experience watching that happen. So some of what I share comes from those disaster stories. More recently, I was director of a 13-person for-profit up in central New York State, and then ended up in the role of CEO for the last 6 or 8 years that I was there. That gave me an opportunity to actually make decisions about money and implement procedures and policies to try and get control over costs in the world of evaluation. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is hard-earned lessons from that. At this point, though, I am actually an independent consultant. I work for an outfit called Insider, now located in Washington, D.C., previously pre-COVID in Baltimore City. We're all remote now, but I am actually a consultant for that operation. They have me come in and manage staffing and professional development and project management, some other stuff where my dubious experiences are useful. So we're going to talk about making money, and I could go on all damn day about this. So what I tried to do was just sort of pick some big lessons, and we're going to bounce across them. I'm going to back the information truck up, dump out a bunch of ideas, just a prime conversation. As I said, this will take about 15 minutes if things go well. And then we'll have some Q&A time conversations about specific questions or issues. Or if you want to hear some of the horror stories, we can move on to that. They fall out into 4 big categories. Number one, anytime you're running a business, you got to make sure you're clear about your first principles, your fundamentals. You've got to understand, and this is extremely important, that in order to control dollars, ultimately make a profit, the decisions get made minute by minute. And we'll talk about strategies to manage minutes to control dollars. We're also going to talk about stamping out scope creep. Scope creep is I think probably is a curse for any small business person or consultant. I think it's particularly rampant in the business of evaluation. We'll talk about why and some things you can do to get around that. And we're going to talk about, and this feels a little backwards, but we're going to talk last about how to write proposals to set yourself up for profits. Because I need to talk about a few things that will relate back to when we talk about proposals, even though in our business cycle, we do proposals first. All right, so first of all, in terms of fundamentals, and some of this is going to seem a little preachy, but honestly, trust me that some of these things that I'm going to state as axiomatic, as things you can really hang a hat on, will get screwed up over and over and over and over, and I continue to make these mistakes. So, nobody's perfect, but some of these things are really, really crucial that you get clear about when you're running a consulting firm, particularly in the business of evaluation. Number one, separate in your head the difference between price and cost. We tend to get that stuff all squished together, and partially that's because that's a way that our clients often talk about us as a cost. But you've got to make sure that you're clear about your pricing model and how it relates to the costs that you incur for delivering the work for which the client pays money, the price. And part and parcel of this is recognizing that time is a cost. And that's a huge part of what this conversation is going to be about, because dollars in and of themselves don't make any sense unless you think about them as they relate to the hours necessary to earn them. Number two, talent costs money. If you were going to get a job with some other entity doing exactly what you are doing today, you ought to know what your salary expectations would be. And your business decisions as a consultant ought to take that into consideration. Not to put too fine a point on it, I know folks that by the time they get done doing everything they do to run their own business, frankly, they could be working full-time at a much less stressful position, managing a Lowe's home improvement department, and probably have more time to spend with their families. So you've got to be doing that math. Consultants are their own employees. I don't have the chat visible, but it would be interesting to know how many of you are your only employee. But importantly, make sure that you understand that you play, as a consultant, two different roles and wear two different hats. Sometimes you need to think of yourself as the company owner, the company. And sometimes, and this is, we aren't good at this collectively as consultants, you need to think of yourself as an employee of that company. And the tension of working that out is part of the fundamentals that you've got to acknowledge when you are making decisions about money in this business. Additionally, and this is a hard concept to get around sometimes, but your company should make a profit. So after the company pays you to do what you do in your job wearing your employee hat, there ought to be excess revenues sitting around that can get turned into other things, into capital investments for long-term growth, into expanding the company, into cash reserves, so you don't struggle with cash flow and have to make decisions based on cash flow rather than on profitability, which we could talk more about that. But at the end of the day, your balance sheet ought to be increasing even as you're paying yourself to do the work that you're doing. And ultimately, all of this is about this hopeful reality that you can have work-life balance in this business. I worry a lot about folks that lose track of that as a first principle. It's very, very dangerous to do. So in terms of managing minutes to control dollars, if you take away one thing from this conversation, if I get directive, the most important thing that you can do starting tomorrow is to keep track of all of the hours that you spend working on your consulting work. And keep track of it by project, by client. So if you've got a contract to do X, Y, and Z, make sure that when you're working on X, Y, or Z, you got the clock running. When you're working on new business development stuff, writing proposals or going to conferences or meeting people, keep track of that stuff. It can be as granular as you want, but until and unless you're keeping track of the hours that you're putting into your work, you are never, ever going to have full control over the fiscal position of your consulting gig. It will always be running you rather than having you run it. There's other corollaries to this, like, when does work end and life begin and things like that, but that might be another conversation. Doesn't have to be complicated, doesn't have to be fancy. I use my Google Calendar. I put in appointments, I keep track of the time, I put in the actual time afterward. At the end of each week or month, I can go back and look and see how much time I spent on various functions that I have to support. More complicated and harder to do, but equally important, is projecting the amount of time that is going to be required for the tasks that you've got to do. We do in this business a pretty substantial volume, as an example, of qualitative analysis. So you do focus groups, you do interviews. Before you start analyzing those 10 focus groups and producing some deliverable for a client, You need to decide how much time you're going to spend on that analysis and do the amount of analysis that can get done in that number of hours. I use this example because qualitative analysis is super easy to get sucked into and just doing more and more and more and more of. Or pursuing interesting ideas. Oh, I'll go look at this question. Do what's required, get it tasked out, timelined, and projected before you start, and then try and stick to that. Because if every interview takes 15% longer to analyze than you originally anticipated and priced it, that's your profit gone, even if you're paying yourself. So project the time, track the time, and work on understanding what that means in terms of informing your work. Very importantly, account for the time required to get work, including the informal stuff. Keep track of that. Understand what good enough means. We're all mercenaries in this business, right? Every piece of work we do can't be a dissertation quality analysis and report. We've got to make sure that we are maintaining and have clear in our heads what an appropriate quality is for the outputs, for the analysis, the services, or whatever that we're doing for the client before we get going, and stick to that. And if you've got anyone working for you, either as a true employee or, as we often do, as collaborators, partners, other consultants that you pull in to do particular kinds of work, all of this stuff becomes 10 times more important than if it's just you. Because when you task something out to somebody, you need to make sure that they know how much time they can spend and how many of your dollars are going to burn up in order to do that. Let's talk about scope creep. Scope creep, by definition, is you got a set of work that you've promised, services and deliverables. Scope creep is where all of a sudden you're doing work that's not in that initial plan. So I'll give you a quick example. I wrote a proposal and we got a yes, and we sent off the scope of work to set up the contract, and the client sent it back to me with one edit. They put in 10 focus groups of students as after school program, 10 focus groups, virtual, online, of kids and instructors. And I went, okay, that's super interesting. I'll tell you how I dealt with that here. Where do I want to? I'll talk about that when I get down to my fourth bulleted item on this list. But this is very, very common. Hey, can you just come out and do this? Or hey, can you look at this instrument that I know we didn't talk about, right? Once the scope of work is established and agreed to, keep a working version of that document ready and handy so as it changes, and it will, they always change. Can't do focus groups, got to do this other thing. Oh, didn't like the questionnaires, going to do this other thing. Oh, can you do a quick report because we need to send this off as part of a proposal? All of that stuff needs to get documented in real time as it changes. And what I do is just use track changes and edit that original scope of work. And I reference in notes the email, because you want it in writing, when someone says, we're going to do this thing instead of this other thing. As the scope changes, document the life cycle of that evolution. So when inevitably push comes to shove and someone squawks, you've got clear documentation of how the work did or did not creep. So this learn how to say yes thing was a huge step. We used to, when I was up at this firm in New York, we used to do professional development on this, and we'd role play. And so I'd sit down with one of my researchers and I'd say, okay, I'm going to be the client, you're the researcher. So tell me about a project. They say, well, I'm doing this thing and this, we're doing this questionnaire, online questionnaire, and they're going to do an annual report at the end of the year. So, all right, so I'm the client. So I'm like, all right, Carol, this is great, it's fabulous, but I need something to show the funders next month. Can you do that for me? And the answer should always be yes, but it should always be yes, but. Yeah, that would be great. That sounds like it would really add value to the work. Would you like me to do a quote and tell you how much more that will cost? And that does one of two things. It either sets you up to make more money, because this example of the focus groups, I went back to the client and said, yeah, we could do that. It's going to cost you 50% more than we originally budgeted for the whole project. Oh, okay, well, we've got some extra money because we didn't spend it on program delivery during COVID. I was like, sweet. So we won on that deal. The other thing it might do is force them to ask how much they're really committed to that new thing. And if they're not willing to spend more money, then maybe they don't need it. Or they'll say, can we get that instead of this other thing, at which point you go back to your working scope of work, track it as a change, and move on with life. So always say yes, but always say yes in a way that prevents you from getting burned. And last but not least on this list is if you give something to someone as a freebie, and we do this occasionally, it's like, yeah, you know what? It takes me no time at all. This is a value add. I'll write you a paragraph to stick in this proposal you're working on about what this evaluation is doing for you, or whatever. Make sure you're explicit that you're giving them a freebie. Say, yeah, that's not in the scope of work, but I think we can make that happen. Stick it in your working scope to indicate you added something, didn't charge for it, but help them know that that does have value, because if you start giving away the cow, all of a sudden you're not selling any milk. That's a lousy analogy, but you know what I mean, right? So don't destroy your inherent value with the client by giving away the services that they are paying you for. All right, last but not least, propose for profit. So this is about that process up front where you've got some request for work. I call it an opportunity, right? So someone has said, we think we want you to do X, Y, and Z. And it could be an RFP, it could be a referral, it could be somebody saying, yeah, I'm going to propose and I need you to write me an evaluation plan, whatever. First point is make sure as you're talking to the clients that they know that you know the difference between price and cost. Because very often you will find first principles baked into their procurement processes that need to get resolved before you have any chance of being able to set yourself up to propose for a profit. You cannot, I don't think anybody can survive on some of the RFPs that I see out there and the constraints that are placed on costs. Like, you can't charge any indirect, right? So you can only charge exactly what it costs you to pay someone to do the work. You can't add anything to that. Well, how does that work? It's like, so you're taking money and you're let's pretend you're putting your business owner hat. You say, I'm going to bid for this work. I'm going to pay Kirk, the employee, $20,000 to work on this project for half a year. If I'm just passing that money through, then something is getting lost in the exchange. So understand that you're willing to talk to them about the difference between price and cost and translate what you understand about it into their contracting. Establish hourly rates and stick to them. This goes back to the how much money should you be making as an employee of your consultancy. And you need to be able to say, the company's got to charge X dollars an hour for me to take some portion of X dollars an hour and to cover overhead and to cover put some nuts in a hollow tree over here in terms of profit that we can use those funds later for other purposes. Write them down and stick with it. I've got multiple rates that I apply to different rules for my work depending on what I'm doing. So when I'm working for Insider, because I don't have to pursue the work, they just say, come do this, come do that. My hourly rate is less because I don't have to account for business development time in those hours. When I do work that I'm out chasing, that I have to spend time for free writing a proposal, my rate is higher applied to that kind of work. And I've got a third rate, which is I know you're going to be a pain in my butt rate, and nobody else can do what you're going to ask me to do. and I can afford to be mercenary, and I pull that thing out and I slap it down on the table and they go, oh, okay. And occasionally they go for it because they really need me. Please make sure that you're estimating your task time, don't say tax time, I don't know anything about that. Your task times for proposal writing, estimate those as accurately as you can. We used to have an exercise where I'd sit down with a new researcher. I'd say, all right, you got to write a proposal budget. I don't know how to do that. So, well, you know how to do the work. So we got this templates, big spreadsheet. You're going to do X focus groups. You're going to do an online questionnaire. You don't have to develop the questionnaire because they already have it. You're going to collect X number of these things it's going to cost. There's going to be direct costs associated with that software. And you're going to do an interim report halfway through the thing to give them an update. And then you're going to do a final report. And it's probably going to be about 20 pages. Go through and tell me, in your experience, how many hours each of those things are going to take, who's going to be doing them, and it'll spit out a price. But I'd cover up the price. All right, so I wouldn't let them see the final total. They'd go tickety, tick, 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 and they'd estimate the time. I said, all right, great. Now, so I'm the client. That's too much money. That says $36,000. I can only spend $30,000. What do you do? So they'd go in and they'd start taking out hours. They didn't take out any work. They just took out the hours that they had estimated to get the price down to the target price that the client, me, was asking for. So that is super dangerous. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that in 2 bullets. But estimate the prices at the proposal stage because you're going to have to ultimately do the work for whatever you have committed to. Make sure that you budget for project management. It takes time to manage projects. I arrived at, you know what, if you don't know any better, you do all of the data collection, analysis, and reporting tasks, throw 15% at it, and at least you know that you've got that cushion in there. Some clients or some kinds of work, particularly like if you got a team of people you have to work with, we got 6 partners on this NSF project. Well, that's going to put a burden on project management. You're just going to need to make sure you put hours in there. It doesn't just happen by itself. And thinking, I'll just do that at night after the kids go to bed is violating one of our first principles. So don't get sucked into that trap. Price match only with extreme caution. If you've got, if somebody says, yep, that's great, we want you to do the work, or if there's a target price attached to an RFP, the point at which you catch yourself going, what can I do to get to that price? You got to do that very purposefully, very carefully, and only do it by removing work. Don't do it by removing time that you are going to have to spend doing that work. Which brings us to the last point on this list, which is learn the power of nope. So sometimes you do the math and you look at it and you go, they want these 17 things and they got this work over here. I kid you not, we got an email today. Client says, hey, we got our NSF project. We didn't write in an evaluator. Do you want to be our evaluator? I said, sure, let's talk about it. What do we need to do? Well, this, that, and the other thing. All right, what's your budget? $2,500 for 2 years. So they are going to learn the power of nope because there's just no way that is going to happen. Now, that's an extreme case, but you do the math, and if it doesn't fit your first principles and follow some of these rules, then you need to say, you know, I do not want to pay you for the privilege of working for you. And that's ultimately what you're doing if you lose control of your price and cost questions and stop making money on this work that we are so talented and should get paid real dough to do. So, as I said, thus endeth the lesson.